All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Montclair Planning Board. Notice of this meeting is given by publishing in the local newspapers, and also by posting a copy of the notice on the first floor of the municipal building. And electronic notice is provided by posting a copy of the meeting notice on the township website. The meeting is being broadcast live on Channel 34 and is streaming live and will be available for demand on YouTube. This is a quasi-judicial proceeding, meaning that this board has powers and procedures that resemble a court of law, and we are obligated to objectively determine facts and draw conclusions from them in order to provide the basis for official action. Any questions or comments that are made during the meeting should be of the type that the board may legally consider in reaching a decision, and decorum appropriate for a judicial proceeding must be maintained at all times. First thing on our agenda this evening is our roll call.
Vice Chair Brodock.
I'm here.
Mr. Graham.
Here.
Mr. Ian Wally.
Here.
Ms. Lockman.
Here.
Mr. Ortiz. Oh. We have a vacancy. Mr. Pierre.
Present.
Councilor Schlager.
Here.
Ms. Willis.
Here.
Mr. Nguyen.
Here.
Mr. Jacobson.
Here.
Mr. Neiman.
Here.
And Mr. Neese.
Here.
Okay. We don't have any minutes from our last meeting. It's much too soon. But we do have some resolutions. And Janice, you want to run through them?
Yes, we did had a different procedure this year for our board professionals. The township has a new policy and requires us to generate or issue an RFQ every year. And part of that RFQ for board professionals is the submission of proposals. So we did receive multiple proposals, and the Personnel Committee did meet and recommend retaining all of our present professionals with the exception of board engineer. And we're in the process of interviewing firms for the position of board engineer. So the first resolution is to retain Beattie Padovano as board attorney. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Why'd you look at me? I was going to thank you.
Well, Art, I made the motion. You should thank me. Yeah, so.
I recognize the only reason you keep me around is you, okay?
The second resolution is to retain Eric M. Bernstein and Associates as conflict attorney. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the third is to retain Brightview Engineering as traffic engineering for 2023. Is there a motion to approve that resolution? Okay.
I'll move that.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Abstentions?
I'm also a no.
He's opposed to.
Jeff and Carmel, right? Okay.
Janice, just as a point of procedure, is there an opportunity in the future to have a conversation about the professionals in advance so that we can hear the reasoning behind some of the board members' decision-making if they're opposed, and perhaps they could sway us? I want to know if there's an opportunity for us to have more in-depth discussion about professionals.
I think if we did that, we'd probably have to go into closed session.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
I would recommend for next year that we could have a
I put it
special
under
session
closed
behind
session.
closed doors,
Okay.
because I would be interested to hear others' opinions.
absolutely. Okay. Moving on. Resolution to retain Level G Associates as parking expert for 2023. Is there a motion?
So moved?
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, and finally, we have Barton, Ross and Partners as board architect. Is there a motion to retain Barton as the board architect?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, yeah, in the past, we haven't gone into closed session to discuss, but I could certainly do that for next year.
Okay,
Okay.
yes, let's do that
Yeah,
next time.
all right.
All right, then that brings us to the continued discussion on the Lackawanna Plaza redevelopment plan.
Okay,
Good evening, Ira.
just to preface, I know I sent a memo trying to summarize the comments that I received from last meeting. I wasn't focusing so much on the comments that were made at the meeting, but trying to summarize as best as I could for tonight's meeting. I also did reach out to the developer, BDP Holdings, and asked for additional information regarding the supermarket. You have the certification that I received today that addresses the concerns that the board raised last week about the supermarket tenant. And I know at the last meeting, you had requests for additional views and perspectives of the building. They did submit that as well, and Ira Smith will be presenting that to the board tonight. That's all I have for now.
So, can I go on record with saying that I thought that the 3D model was totally inadequate? That it didn't really express what's going to be built on this site and wasn't helpful?
I don't have a response to that.
That's fine.
So, Ira, you're ready to proceed? You have something more to tell us this evening?
And is this on? This is the one that has the green light on?
No, it has a label, over the on, broken LED light, works fine.
Oh, God. Don't you love it?
Better?
Yeah, it's better.
That's better.
Thank you, Chair. And board members, good evening. It's good to see you again. As Director Talley explained, the Planning Board asked for additional views of the project. And I think the request was couched in hoping to have a better, what I would call experiential understanding of the project. Experiential meaning how this project will appear in its context from adjacent streets and sidewalks. It's impossible to get that from any model, no matter how large or small, so I think it's valuable that we're doing this. And just as the master plan refers to working with form-based code, in a form-based code scenario, you typically do have a chance to evaluate projects in a number of media. So we have received a number of brand new images from the redeveloper, and they're teed up on the laptop. I'll go through them. I would break my presentation into an agenda because what I'd like to do is share with you the 6 new views. They do work with the photo montages that are already in the redevelopment plan, which correspond to the views that in particular Mr. Ian Wale and Chair Wynn had identified. And then I want to walk through the sky exposure plane analysis. This shows how the underlying geometry, and this is the part where you feel free to chuckle, but this is the part where the underlying geometry that I'm going to show you is exploited in order to fit an 87-foot tall building into a 4-story, 47-foot tall envelope. Yes, as crazy as that sounds. And then we'll go back to the photo montages, which have a special group of layers. I'm calling them photo montage X-rays. And this will show you, it'll be a direct comparison of the 4-story envelope, which the master plan recommends in general for the town center, how that four-story envelope works with the proposed massing. I hope you'll see that the goal of the master plan, which is to respect the feel, the idea of four-story limit in the town center, is respected more closely and embodied by the redevelopment plan than is obvious from a model or from two-dimensional imagery. And we can kind of go from there. So I will start the presentation right now with the 6 new views. We'll walk through them. I'll orient you. As I said, I'll then talk about the underlying geometric analysis, and then we'll see those views again with a little bit more information about how I think the project will appear in reality from ground level. We there? On? Great. And as I've stated before, I want to repeat that all the imagery you're about to see was prepared for the township by the redevelopment team. Obviously, there's a collaborative aspect to this, including, views, angles that we propose that the redevelopment team is working with. And these images comport with the redevelopment plan and represent what's possible under the redevelopment plan. It's not necessarily exactly what will be proposed, but it is in line with what the township, I think, is looking for and what the redevelopment team itself is hoping to do. So in our first view, which corresponds to photo montage 1, we are standing at the corner, almost at the corner of Grove and Bloomfield Ave. On the left, we can see Station Square with its turret. And just beyond that, the waiting room. And then in the middle distance is Building C, the freestanding building. And middle left is the supermarket building.
Ira?
Yes.
That's not Grove. That's Gates Avenue.
Gates, I'm sorry. Yeah. Grove is coming up. Sorry, thank you for the correction. So here we are at Bloomfield, looking sort of northwest with Grove across middle right, Building C in the middle of the image, and the waiting room just to the left of that. You've seen this image before. There's really a total of 7 images, so I didn't count this one when I referred to the total of 6 new. We're on Elm, technically, looking north to Grove. Bloomfield Avenue is the cross street running side to side. Building C, the freestanding building, is just beyond the Exxon sign. Building E, obviously, is on the other side of Grove, on the southeast corner of the site. Now we've traveled north, and we're looking south on Grove. Glenridge is the cross street running side to side. So we've got buildings D and E on the left, and we've got building B in the foreground on the right. And we can obviously come back to these images at any time. Another view requested. We're on Glen Ridge, and we've got Lackawanna Plaza just to our right, just off to the right. And obviously we're looking east, and we can see, obviously, the massing on the right, representative of Building B. Another view requested. We are at Clover Hill on Glen Ridge. So Clover Hill's to the right, looking west. And the building mass project is on, obviously, the middle left. We're back on Bloomfield Avenue, and we've got the Montclair Mews on the right. And so this is Building E. There have been a lot of questions about Building E, which has several step backs, both on Bloomfield Avenue and facing the Montclair Mews. So that's the building in back of the Montclair Mews is the proposed project. So that's our series of views, photo montages. And what I'd like to do now is walk you through the geometry used to figure out like, well, how will these buildings feel? How will they be perceived from the street level? So the redevelopment team became a student of area projects, including Seymour Street. These are very difficult for you to see. I'm sorry about that. But Seymour Street, the Vestry, Valley and Bloom, and the Montclairian. And what they found was that the more recent projects that employ stepbacks typically have a sky exposure plane of 50 degrees. And the 50 degrees is basically saying from the ground plane, like a compass, go up 50 degrees, and all building mass falls below that angle. The rule's obviously broken for Valley and Bloom, which is a much taller structure and generally sheer. So I believe the number on that was more like 58 degrees.
And that's from the middle of the road? Or from what
It
vantage
is.
point?
These are all taken from the middle of the road. That's right. Now the next set looked more closely at buildings that tend to be sheer without stepbacks. And you can see just right away, the angles are more steep. Oops. So, for example, the upper left, the Glen Willow Lofts at Glen Ridge and North Willow, sheer structure, and that's coming in at 65 degrees, obviously more steep. The Midtown parking deck on Glen Ridge, 63 degrees. The Seymour Street parking deck, 59 degrees. So this information was taken into account by the redevelopment team when they began plotting the massing of their structures and establishing how far to set the buildings back from the street, as well as how deep to make the step backs as the buildings rose. Generally, the sweet spot of 50 degrees is what the redevelopment plan and the building masses are respecting. Generally, it's actually below. Sometimes the redevelopment plan, when you reverse engineer the setbacks and stepbacks that are shown in the plan, you're really getting sky exposure planes around 25 degrees to 55 degrees, with most around 45 to 50 degrees. Now, paradoxically, going back to what I said when I began my presentation, a taller building can have a lower sky exposure plane than a shorter building when setbacks and stepbacks are taken into account. So for example, let's look at this middle image. Building B, that's the one facing Glen Ridge. So RDP, that's the redevelopment plan. It's calling for a sky exposure plane of 55 degrees. That's this light blue line. I hope you can see it. And you can see that's shallower than the equivalent sky exposure plane for a 4-story building at 47 feet. That would be 60 degrees. Or a 6-story building at 67 feet. That would be 67 degrees. Now, how is that possible? Look at the red line. So that's representative of your typical building on a typical limited setback in the town center. When you bring the building face back and then you start to step it, you are falling underneath the typically steep angle you get with a 4-story, 47-foot high or 6-story, 67-foot high structure. This is an important point. Now you might say, well, it's still the case that there's like a chunk of building that's taller. Of course, that is true. But that part of the building only becomes more and more visible the further you are away from the project. So when we're talking about a pedestrian, we're talking about people driving through the streets, for them, the perception of the building, because of the way the lower mass cuts off your viewing angle, the experience is typically of a 4-story structure. I might have made this point more clearly at the Historic Preservation Commission last week, but I'd like to make it now too, that almost in general, the project is designed to read as 4 stories or less when experienced within or in the immediate streets. Building D is a positive example in that direction, in that it actually reads more like a one-story structure along Glen Ridge. So this is building D, where the surrounding context does step down. So you can see there's a taller ground floor base, it steps back, and it continues to step back in order to reduce its apparent mass to the public. I'm sure this presentation will be shared with you. There are a number of these pages. And yeah, I don't think I'm going to take you through each of these diagrams. Instead, unless you'd like me to, these actually do cut sections through almost every building and almost every street.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm looking at the structures that you have there, and if you're looking at it from, say that, I presume that is looking at it with the setbacks, you're on Bloomfield Avenue side?
This group happens to be taken along Bloomfield Avenue,
Right.
yes.
But if you're on the Glen Ridge side and you don't have the same step backs on the other side of the building, do you get the same benefit if you're on the street that, where the tall side of the building is? Because the step backs are not on both sides of the building.
Well, in fact, all the buildings step back, whether we're facing Glen Ridge, Grove,
No,
or
excuse me,
Bloomfield.
I'm saying, I'm looking at your diagram, that's what's confusing to me.
Sure.
When I look at the diagram, I can see step backs if I'm on Bloomfield Avenue, but if I'm on Glen Ridge Avenue, it looks like very tall building. So why not have the step backs on both sides?
Is that showing the whole building, or is that just showing a portion?
It's showing a portion of the building, like maybe the first 7,500 feet of the building adjacent to that particular street.
So does the plan project? Thank you. Does the plan project that the buildings are going to be like layer cakes, so that you'll have a wraparound setback that goes on all four sides? That's the same on all four sides?
It does project stepping back as you get higher, like a layer cake. Because the conditions of the immediate context vary, the step backs are not equivalent on each frontage. But to demonstrate my point, I'll go to the next slide.
So it's going to be like a lopsided layer cake? Maybe one that got pushed over on one side.
That feels like a trap.
No, just trying to break it down to a real world analogy.
So an asymmetrical layer cake is what I would go with.
Okay, fair enough. It's always something.
All right, good? Okay, so to illustrate how the buildings do step back, whether you're facing north, south, east, or west, I'll call your attention to, this is building B, and this is building D. So these red lines are showing us the corresponding to this drawing and this one, how we're stepping back on Glen Ridge. I believe the next slide has companion drawings for building B and D, but and cut through Grove Street. Oh yeah, go ahead, thank you. All right, that's Bloomfield Ave. Next one. So okay, now you see all these red lines. Now we're cutting through all the buildings and how they relate to Grove Street. So drawing two is showing us for building B, it does have a step back. It's shallower, facing Grove Street. Building A, which is this section here, it's obviously very far back from Grove because although it's not drawn in, this is where we've got that station plaza. Current zoning is what you're seeing when you see the red line or the green line, whether it's a 4-story or a 6-story structure. So building A is set far back, and it has a step back as well facing Grove. And our third section cut, which is Building C, we can see how we've got a step back on Grove. So I hope, Ms. Willis, does that clarify what you were wondering about, how the buildings relate to the...
It's a little still fuzzy for me. I liked the Chair Wynn's analogy of the layer cake. So how much is it a layer cake? If you're looking at all the four sides of the building, is it any place where you're going to find it looks very tall? Because the diagram you show there looks as though the setbacks are really dramatic on one side, but not on the other. So but your picture does not look like a layer cake, and in fact, it doesn't look. You can't. The other setbacks are not really visible. If they're there, they must be pretty slight because they're not visible. So I'm just wondering, just how high does the building look if you're on a different street? Does it look just as nice as it does on Bloomfield Avenue? Or
I
not
could
as
not
nice?
have created a better segue to the third part of my agenda, which are these views of the photo montages that superimpose the four-story appearance that I've been referring to. I think that will get to what you're asking about. So
Can I ask
I
a-
have one question
oh,
about,
go ahead, Sean.
just one question. The red lines, is that two property line? Every vertical red line intersects a property line? So the assumption of,
yeah,
so that would be on the property line. How much space, if, let's say the buildings were
That's
built
what I
like
want
that,
to look like.
how much space does that leave for sidewalk in those scenarios where you depict the 47-foot building being at the property line? Does it leave just, what is, I can't quite see from here. Just a minimal
yeah,
sidewalk?
it's approximately 10 feet.
10 feet to the curb. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you can see in this diagram, in 3 of the 4 drawings, that the gray mass, the proposed building, add to the depth of the sidewalk, and that's uniformly true in almost every location. The building masses here are further set back in order to create more generous sidewalks, which will also be apparent in this next group of images.
Before you leave that, Ira?
Yes.
So you've shown the views from Glenridge Avenue, Bloomfield Avenue, but behind the buildings, D and E, are the Matthew Carter houses and the Montclair Mews. What are they seeing? Are they seeing a sheer wall of building all the way from Glenridge Avenue to Bloomfield Avenue?
No, I mean, they're seeing building mass for sure, but I've heard people refer to it as a solid 4-story, 5-story mass, which is not correct. I could go back to a prior presentation that actually has that view, that shows how the massing relates to the Montclair Mews and the Matthew Carter homes.
So those two buildings are 75 feet in the plan, and you're not showing, do you have any setbacks on that side of the building that abuts
Yes,
Matthew Carter?
absolutely.
Oh, they're just not shown here, you're just showing street views.
These are all focused on street views,
Okay.
but we do have views that we've shown before, and I can bring up
Okay,
tonight.
no, it's just a
Uh,
question. Yeah,
yeah.
it's in the plan, I can look at it.
And it's, now, see, this is really a good, models are often coupled with drawings because you can learn something from a model that you won't get from a drawing and vice versa. If you were to review the model again, which I know you loathe, you'd
Well,
be
I
able to...
don't loathe it. I understand that there was an 8-foot model at one point that really set the project within the neighborhood. And to substitute that model for a model the size of a conference room table really does the project an injustice, or does the education of the planning board an injustice, so.
Well, again, the models were created with an intent to be informative and useful for this board. And your question is actually beautifully answered by the larger scale model on your right, because you'll be able to see the Montclair Mews as well as how buildings D and E step down in relation to it.
But is it?
Sorry, is it in the plan, the redevelopment plan?
Absolutely,
That's what the
yes.
governing document is.
Yes,
I don't know
these-
how these models relate to the redevelopment plan. Are
These-
they part of the record, so that if someone looked at those models and said, oh, that seems like wasn't built correctly or something, I don't know. Is that part of the redevelopment plan that the developer has to adhere to?
The answer is yes, and I can tell you that the redevelopment team is working with modeling, building modeling, digital modeling, and that was the source of a lot of the geometry for the sky exposure plane, as well as setting up the views so they could be photo matched to the angles we wanted. That same model was used to 3D print both of those models. They're all tied together in the same digital space. So those models could disappear, and if someone wanted to recreate them, it would be possible to do it with what's in the redevelopment plan.
Okay.
They coordinate.
But I have one quick question on that. When I'm looking at figure 6, it doesn't list any setbacks or stepbacks for building D against the Matthew Carter houses or the Muse.
All right.
And that's one thing I did want to
Right,
drill
well-
in on a little bit as Ms. Lockman raised
Yeah,
it.
I just wanted to point out that on that same page, this is page 27, we do have a 30-foot setback from the Montclair Muse.
For building E.
Right, so there's a 30-foot setback for Montclair Muse, plus a step back of 5 feet for the 5th floor and 15 feet for the 6th. So we were really concerned about the Muse because they're the closest houses, but you're right, we don't have specific setbacks or step backs for the building where it's adjacent to the Matthew Carter houses, and we can take a look at that.
Yeah.
Because that is adjacent to a parking lot, so we weren't quite as concerned, but I think we can take a look at that as well.
So, thank you, Janice. I'm going to pass around the model because it does show the massing and how it breaks down or reduces toward the parking lot to the west of the Matthew Carter homes. And obviously, you'll be able to visualize the stepping happening near the Montclair Muse.
I read a question. So when we talk about
But that,
It doesn't have to always remain. It's not always going to be a parking area, potentially. And we have to think about future scenarios.
And plus, people are walking up Glen Ridge Avenue, we're looking at that as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
right.
This is Matthew Carter's parking area, correct?
It is.
Yeah.
So when you talk about setbacks, if you envision per se a wedding cake, right, with tiers.
Yeah.
Okay. You see a wedding cake all around. The wedding cake looks the same, right? It goes up. But that's not the case here. We have a solid wall, and the wedding cake is only one side. Is that right?
The model, if you can imagine that being a small, like, cake, it's not quite as simple as that. And I'd like to point out that the parking area at the Montclair Muse that I was just referring to is also the formal ingress route for fire safety equipment. So that lane will be preserved on the eastern edge of the redevelopment plan. It's very important that fire trucks have access to the middle of that complex. So yes, it's true, Montclair Muse might change over time, but servicing it is a very specific route getting in and out of that property right now.
Ira, does the next set of slides have another view of the one from Clover Hill? If so, I'll hold my question.
Yes,
Okay.
we're going to see the Clover Hill view again.
and then while we're still on setbacks and stepbacks, and again, I'm looking at figure 6 in the plan, page 27, I think Mr. Ianwali said. It's depicting setbacks and stepbacks in the area of that linear arts plaza, right? And so, what does the plan require? I mean, I know it requires this linear arts plaza, but when the figure shows that somebody could follow the plan and presumably build right up to Grove Street, it gives me a little bit of concern. And so I was wondering, what we're looking at in digital space here on the projections, what we see in the model, is that representative of that, I'll call it almost a full build-out condition all the way to Grove, or is it more representative of what we see again on figure 6 that shows building D set back a ways?
I'm glad you're calling attention to that. What's depicted in Figure 6 on page 27 for the Linear Arts Plaza is actually showing you what the build-out, the allowable build-out would be, which brings you out toward the sidewalk. It doesn't take into account the Linear Arts Plaza, probably should. If our intent is to memorialize that space as not buildable, yeah.
Yeah, because that's my concern, right?
Uh-huh.
Is that we have, what I presume, so just to answer the question then, so what you're showing digitally and in the model is more representative of Building D as shown on this figure and not built all the way to Grove?
That's right. The sort of salmon color of building footprints is what's modeled physically and on screen.
Okay, then yeah, I think we should definitely find a way to adjust those setbacks and step backs along that Linear Arts Plaza to reflect that condition, that we're seeing in the salmon color and that we're seeing in our digital models as well.
Mm-hmm, yep.
I have another question. And looking at the rendering that's up on the screen at the moment, now you've got the rooftops there. Are we going to be seeing poking up above those rooftops elevator shafts and utility buildings, and so that
Water tower?
are we going to see other levels above those rooftops as we're seeing? So the building is going to look actually taller than the stories that it's specified at?
So
That's a yes or no question.
Well, you listed several possible rooftop uses. Bulkheads for stairs and elevators will be there. There are no plans, the redevelopment plans not allow for penthouse, clubhouse, rooftop kinds of space.
No, I'm talking about utilities, like air
Utilities.
conditioning units, whatever machinery needs to go up there.
Yes, yes.
So, and because I don't know, I mean, that particularly on the building that's on the east side of Grove Street, that's a pretty big building, and I imagine it's going to have some pretty big air conditioning generators or whatever. And so, I'm imagining that that's going to take up, a good space. I mean, it's not going to take up the whole rooftop, but it's going to take up a good space. On the other buildings, the one that's on the corner, I guess it could be smaller, but it depends on where the stairwells are, where internally how they design it as to where the stairwells are, as to whether you're going to see them from the street. And I think what we've learned from the buildings that have been built to date in the town is that when we see these renderings here, the real thing looks taller because we've got all these things jutting up on top of it.
Understood.
I have actually 2 points. One, our existing ordinance where it includes limitations for penthouses and rooftop equipment, that would apply. And this issue has come up, and we discussed potential changes to this. We do know that there is a cooling tower proposed for the living building. Is that the Living Building Challenge building?
What's that? Which is the Living Building
Building
Challenge?
C, that's the ultimate in terms of sustainability.
That's the name of it, the Living Building Challenge
I
Building?
believe that's what it's called.
It's a program, a criteria,
Okay,
the next, LEED 2.0.
okay, thank you.
And we do know it needs cooling towers, and the cooling towers are a certain size. So we want to more narrowly define the rooftop equipment.
Mhm.
And it, basically in terms of the height and the amount of the roof. So it's only for a small section of it, and it has to be in the middle of the building.
Janice, could you describe the statutory requirements that you were referring to earlier, that they have to adhere to? Just, you don't have to give me the entire,
We rewrote.
just in generalities.
We rewrote the zoning ordinance for rooftop equipment, and it's very narrowly conscripted in our current ordinance. I couldn't tell you what it is, but it requires it to be screened. It requires it to be only a small percentage of the building. So we're aware of that, and I think we need to tighten up the regulations.
Well, and my problem is that, I hear what you're saying, but that doesn't tell me what it's going to look like. And is it going to, theoretically, the conclusion that I think you'd like me to draw from your statement is that it's going to look better than what we have seen in the past, okay? But
Well, the only way
I
can-
have my doubts.
The only way I can tell you that is if we put the regulations in the plan to ensure it.
But even with the regulations, on these massing projections, I want to see that mass. I want to see how that mass would possibly look, worst-case scenario.
Well,
Because I know you don't have architectural plans for the
Right.
buildings, okay? So you can't tell me exactly where they're going to be. So give me the worst-case scenario, so that I know anything, that's as bad as it's going to look. And then, we get better from there.
we can get you part of the way there tonight, Chair, through the power of the model, which actually shows the bulkheads. The plans have been developed to a point where it's clear where elevator banks and circulation is likely to land. And so if
But you
someone
have
wants
so you
to,
had that stuff already. Why aren't they on those drawings?
they may well be. I wasn't able to, it's only been 1 week, and I wasn't able to supervise all details of this presentation. If I could turn around and just ask for a nod, whether they're included or not, someone in the audience might know. Okay.
I'll find out.
So we don't know if they're in the visual imagery, but again, as I said, models and drawings complement one another. I invite anyone to just pick up the model as it's intended to and kind of look and see, at least for the bulkheads where the stairs and elevators pop through, you'll get a sense from the model right now.
Well, the cooling tower allows for 20-foot cooling tower,
Right,
So
the
that's
the
pretty
cooling
high.
tower, I'm sure, is not depicted.
right?
Yep, yep.
And you're saying that's only going to be in Building C, which is the
I'm not,
building.
I don't know that. I know that it's
Well, I
a
thought you
more
just said
sustainable
that.
feature, and I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that the aspiration is high for Building C, but it's possible other buildings will want to take advantage of a similar recycling of on-site water. So the cooling tower, as I understand, it's small in footprint, but apparently they are about 20 feet high. The footprint's about 10 by 10.
I thought it was 6 by 6 even.
Yeah, it may have been less than 10 by 10.
Well, that would have been good to see or know,
But-
because
Right, well, that's why,
you see 20 feet above 87 feet, and you say, oh, my God, right?
but what my suggestion is, restrict it in size and require it to be located in the center.
Yeah.
So that it's not visible. So
Yeah.
those
Right.
are, that's the language that should be in the redevelopment
Right.
plan to
And-
ensure you,
Right.
we can do it, we can show you a lot of different renderings, but that doesn't mean that that's the site plan that they'll come up with. What's really important is the language that's in our redevelopment plan.
And so why are we going from what's already in our ordinance, 10 feet, to 15 feet on this for the other mechanicals?
I think we could go down to 10, except for the cooling towers, which are
Oh,
taller.
is that what you're saying, that you
Yeah.
want to do? Okay.
Yeah. And just to remind everyone, Building C, the one that has the sort of highest aspiration for sustainable design, it is also 5 stories, it's not one of the taller ones.
Well, it's 75 feet. Yeah,
Agreed?
in the plan. Yeah, that's tall enough for me.
Also, I have a question, Ira, as going back to what Chair Wynn said, at some point, will there ever be additional height for any cell phone towers or antennas? We had another development right down the road from here, that after everything was said and done, they needed some Verizon towers attached to the side of the buildings.
I can answer that
Yeah,
question. The
please.
redevelopment plan is silent on that, so right now the answer is no. Unless you want to
Well,
put
we
it
would have
in
to
there.
say no. We would
What-
have to explicitly say it, correct?
No, it's not a permitted use. If they wanted to put a tower there or antennas, they'd have to come in, they have to amend the plan. Right now, it's not included in our list of permitted uses.
So we should probably, though, say anyway,
Yeah.
we would recommend against it so that it doesn't come up
Affirmatively
later
state,
and
yeah.
people say, okay.
Yeah.
We should, thank you, exactly, Jeff.
It just happened down the road.
We should affirmatively say no.
That, right now, it's no. We don't know what the future holds, but the case with Seymour
Agreed.
Street is because there was antennas previously there that we didn't know of when we were doing the plan, so that's part of the reason. But right now, it's not permitted. So it's,
I'm sorry, Janice, I missed that last part. She said the reason why the antenna went in Seymour Street is because there had been one previously.
there had been one there,
Okay.
and there was a gap. So it took us a year and a half to come up with the appropriate language to amend that plan to ensure that it wouldn't be visible. So
While we're,
my suggestion is, rather than, here's what I would think, because this issue hasn't even come up. Rather than prohibit it, make it permitted, but it has to be entirely hidden. It has to be part of the architecture. Because you may need antennas. The problem is you don't want to see them. So I think it might be better to put language that if antennas are required, they should be built into the architecture of the building and fully screened, rather than, sticking up or being an extension or addition to the building.
so on that topic, I know telecommunications is shifting away from taller, distant towers to 5G, which is a lot more frequent, generally smaller towers. I don't think it's a bad idea for this to plan to address where within the complex they may be placed, because they have their own sort of aesthetic and technological complications and challenges. And so I think that's something worth considering. And I know that in many cases, municipal power over placement
Right.
can be limited.
I'm just saying, if it's going to happen, plan for it now,
That-
because you don't
yeah.
want to add on to it in the
Absolutely.
future.
And so if we can get that involved early, I think it'll be for the best.
Exactly,
Yeah.
I agree. That was a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
While we're still on this slide, are those the colors, the colors of the buildings, are those what's prescribed by the plan?
No. The images you're seeing are articulated enough to give you a sense of scale. Okay. Oh, good. Thank you. Battery change. I'll switch to that in a second. The plan is, this came up with the Historic Preservation Commission. The plan is notable, let's say, in that it prohibits certain materials, but it permits a wide range. I can list the prohibited materials, I'll probably forget one, but the intention is not to close the door and insist that all the buildings look alike or be made out of the same kinds of materials. Yeah, does that adequately answer your question?
Yeah, it helps.
Yeah.
I'm a little struck by the image that, it shows as like a 3-4 story building, because that's very bright white, and the upper stories are darker and kind of fade into the background. I was
Right.
trying to find out,
Yes. So-
right. But is that prescribed by the plan? Or is this just lucky that it looks this way tonight?
So, that's a great question. It is not prescribed in the plan, except that the plan conceptually requires that the designers start with the premise that buildings have a base, a middle, and a top, which is a classical consideration, and it actually is one of the underlying qualities of the buildings we have in the town center. The fact that the palette, as you see it, is as it is a product of the redevelopment design team already thinking about color and how the choice of a material and tone can impact our perception of bigness, for lack of a better word. So it's not an accident that they're showing the top darker. If you were to invert that, have a darker base and a lighter top, we can all imagine like, wow, that would, in contrast, make the top stories pop more and maybe feel top heavy. So this is architecture at work, but it's an iterative process. So you're seeing conceptually something that is consistent with the redevelopment plan, and it's not luck.
But how do we write that into the plan, right? Because I still will keep coming back to the point that while I appreciate the work that's gone into this, the potential or likely redeveloper, the property owner, this is their vision. We're stuck with this plan that's agnostic on a redeveloper. And so how do you write this plan so that if this falls through yet again, we get something that's closer to that than the inverse?
I'm sure there's some language I could add that refers to the top exploiting different design tools like material choice, reflectivity, scale, contrast with what's below it to minimize its presence, like that sort of thing.
Something like that.
The
We have
reason
some teeth.
the reason the design standards don't go there is that, I was talking about the Claridge Apartments building last time we met. Feels like a month ago, and it was only a week ago. Corner of South Park and Church Street. That's a great building. And 6 stories sheer, it'd be a good building at 4 stories. And if one writes design standards that prohibit outcomes like that, we're maybe missing out on alternative building designs that would be appropriate. But maybe what you're saying, as I hear myself, is that, well, for buildings D&E, this seems to be an effective strategy, and so the design standards could narrow down and address what's happening with buildings D&E and not, therefore, limit what the other buildings might be up to.
Right, and I would, yes. So I think that, at least in this view, that makes sense. I mean, building C, the little cap that's on top, that looks kind of cool, but, my other thought too is, so writing that in is important. And I wouldn't necessarily want to limit somebody's creativity, but at the same time, if it was written in one way, is that a point where somebody says, oh no, I do want the white on top or the bright on top? That would be a waiver. I know I was off on this a week ago in terms of what we could have as a waiver or not. But is that something that's not a bulk requirement that we could waive if somebody came in with some great idea?
Well, I think if so the trickiest part of writing the design standards is to quantify things that a lot of people think can only be subjective. But when you've been studying architecture for 4 years as an undergrad and another 3.5 as a grad student, you realize there are some rules that you can quantify and set down. I would be reluctant to go beyond what I've already said, where the intent is, well, Vice Chair, I need to think about this, because I could imagine a very talented architect coming back and saying the effective building here is maybe one that actually inverts our expectations for base, middle, and top. They're clearly distinctive, but they don't want to go with that palette selection. But I understand, and I'm sympathetic to, and I'm pretty much on board with the idea that we articulate the top when it's stepping back. The intent is to reduce or minimize its appearance or addition to the bulk below it. Like expressing that as an intent, I think would be fine.
Yeah, along with the palette. I'm sure there's language you can use that I don't have that vocabulary that would get to this point. And again, if it's something that's able to be re-reviewed at site plan hearings,
right,
then I think it's okay, right? Again, if we wrote it to look like that and somebody came in and said, I want to totally reverse this whole thing and here's why it works, I think the board would listen.
Yeah.
But just to have some starting point of like, this is what we were presented, this is what we're shown, that's what we're now going to expect we're going to see, for the most part, right? So we're trying to make sure we have that connection down the road.
I appreciate that, and I think we can for sure take a step or two into that, and I'll talk to the director about where those variances or exceptions start to become a problem maybe down the road.
Sure, and again, I'll go back to, not even again, I'll look at Seymour Street. I remember that, what is it, like a silver color, the corner piece, right? That was kind of like a striking, the feature, right.
Corner feature at Seymour,
and I remember at first, folks were like, I don't know, that seems a little bold. That's the right way to put it. But, I think after discussing it and even hearing from the HPC that was on board with it, I think it turned out really nice. So I don't want to limit that kind of creativity, but I also want to make sure we've got enough rules, so to speak, so that we get what we see.
Mm-hmm. I very much appreciate what you're saying, and I think, we will work on that. Thank you. So this group of images, we're now going to see several of the images we've seen previously, but with these overlays, which in my mind relate directly to what board member Willis was talking about. Like, well, how does this notion of sightlines and envelopes for 4- and 6-story buildings really relate to how the stepping back is working? So in this first image, we're seeing an as-of-right 4-story building. So hopefully you can see how these gauzy masses sit forward of the buildings that are proposed. That's because they are on the property line. Similarly, you can see on the right side, I'm going to travel here. Actually, this is a good time to switch. Still with me? Still with me? Testing? Okay. 47 feet total. My guess is this might be 12 or 15, but this was modeled in the digital environment as well. So we can see we're at 4 stories here. We've obviously got the fifth and sixth stories above, but in height, like if I just do that, in height, the aggregate of the 5th and 6th stories are not even more than 1 story of a 4-story building. That's because this 4-story mass is that much closer to us. Now we all know the building from the plan, as Vice Chair Broderick was talking about, like it cuts back, so there's a lot more mass and the canyon-like effect that would happen when you build as of right with 4 stories. That's not what's proposed. And then 6 stories. So you can see, even though, as someone pointed out, we're at 75 feet here, that 75 feet sits lower than a 6-story building would as of right. So 67 feet is bigger than a 75-foot structure. Building C is pushed back several dozen feet. So that's one of the things that contributes to its reduction in apparent size.
A question on the, if we can go back to the 4-story for a second. Ms. Talley, did we recommend or did we include setbacks after the 3rd story, if I'm not mistaken?
In the redevelopment plan?
I'm talking about in the master plan.
It was in the master plan.
If I'm not mistaken, we weren't just stating 4 stories without also requiring setbacks. I believe it was after the 3rd story.
Right, and
Right.
that's the master plan. I'd have to
So
double check.
this wouldn't necessarily be an accurate representation of what could be built as of right.
Well, no, they're looking at the zoning and not the master plan.
I'm just saying for our purposes, so we can get a sense of what would be comparative,
Yeah.
they would still, after the 3rd story, require a setback, yes?
I believe the zoning ordinance was amended. There's a mandatory step back right now.
Mandatory setback, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And don't ask me exactly what it is. I'll have to pull up my ordinance and find out what.
No, not an issue. I just want to make sure that I have clear
It's
in my
missing-
head.
It's missing from these figures.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because-
So the standing zoning, it is still 6, but there's other language saying there's a step back after 3?
I can't recall off the top of my
It was
head, but I know that
four. I'll
after.
have to pu- I'll have to
We'll have to
look it
ta-
up
yeah.
again.
Okay. Well, I think I'm not trying to hide from the fact that this is a taller project. I'm using these illustrations to talk about the different measures taken to undermine, to reduce that apparent heaviness or bulk that people are concerned about.
And we respect that, Mr. Smith. I just think, looking at this, if we were to have similar setbacks at that 47-foot mark, I think you wouldn't have any pushback at all from well, you would have pushback. It's, we're the Montclair Planning Board, and we're going to push back. But I think in general, people would be a lot more comfortable at those heights.
I agree that would be an outcome, but I wouldn't agree with the physiological experience of the place.
In what sense? Because, I'm looking at the renderings. I think you've done a commendable job. I appreciate you bringing in the renderings as they are. I still think the experience, a pedestrian's not going to experience it from the middle of the road, right? They're going to experience it from one side of the sidewalk or another. And you're talking about, the widest boulevard in town, and people are going to see these, I appreciate what our vice chair had mentioned about the color helping and letting things blend in, but you are still seeing substantial, 80-something feet buildings. You can't escape that fact.
Can I just ask a favor? I'm kind of dying to see the rest of these slides. Because
Jeff, am I?
No, I'm just kind of wondering. It's just that I think that a lot of us have similar I'm not trying, I'm just saying, I think a
I'm
lot of
just,
us have
well,
similar
Jeff,
questions and
the
concerns.
genesis of this is because, again, I don't see that as an accurate representation
I'm with you.
of what would happen.
I'm with you, but that's why I want to.
But this, in my, I understand that we all
Yeah.
want to see the rest of the slides, but in my estimation, we had to stop and point out that what we're seeing right now doesn't accurately represent.
Believe it or not, I'm
requirements.
supporting you. I think
Okay.
your point is about to get even more crisp.
I see.
That's where I'm going with this.
All right, thank you, Mr. Jacobson. I will yield.
Just, the zoning is, what is the zoning now? C1? Regardless of the, so it is 6 stories now. Without,
With setbacks, right?
oh, I don't know about that.
I'll have to double check that.
We gotta double, we gotta
I just
confirm.
want to, because we're speaking about the 47 feet that's in the master plan, but that has not been adopted. Is that accurate?
No, the zoning ordinance is 6 stories, 67 feet.
Right now, okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
So this is that view from Grove looking south and Glen Ridge running side to side. So just as a reference point, this is what 4-story buildings without setbacks or stepbacks would do. It creates that canyon effect. So it's the reverse view of what we just saw. I mean, to go to a point just made, certainly this is only one image that like your eye would capture, whether you're crossing the street or in a car, so there are other views, and when you step further back, it's easy for me to argue that these buildings, while you would see them in their totality, you'd be further away from them, so physically they're smaller, they're not as imposing on you. So I still have to say I question the notion that the images are not, quote, representing what it would really be like. Similarly, because of the setting back of the buildings here, even though we're taller than 4 stories, we can see it's one additional story, or the equivalent of a 5-story feeling, let's say, if you were in this position looking at building B.
I suspect, Ira, that the reason why both you and my colleagues are correct is because what you're using there as a depiction of what could exist is if a developer existed in the world who was coming in here with both middle fingers raised and saying, I'm able to develop this, ha-ha, and I don't care what it looks like, it would be that. And so you're correct that that is within plan. It's not what any sane developer would try to build in Montclair, but it's right. So in other words, you're correct that nobody's accusing you of being disingenuous in the sense that you're using the right math. The math works. The practical reality, though, is not a choice between that and what's proposed here. The practical reality is a choice between what's proposed here and something less than what's proposed here.
I appreciate your saying that very much, and I've seen developers play that game where they show, here's what, as of right, I could have done, and you should be pleased I'm not going anywhere near that. I'm actually using these images to make a different point, which I think you're acknowledging, but maybe not agreeing with my conclusion, which is, well, Ira, how will it feel? I would say, well, when you're on Grove, standing at Glen Ridge, those buildings D&E won't appear larger to you in mass than a 4-story building would. I'm not saying, thank goodness, no one's planning a 4-story building. I'm saying because of the way the buildings are set so far back from Grove, and they tier back or step back, that the quality of their imposition will be no more than a 4-story building.
So do me a favor, skip ahead to the Clover Hill view.
Wait,
Okay.
I just have one question about that. So the view that you're showing for the superimposed 4-story building, that's right up to the sidewalk, right?
Yes.
But you can't, because that's the embankment, that's a separate easement there. You can't build on that easement, as I understand it. So you could never build that 4-story building on the left-hand side. Is that correct?
I don't know enough about that easement, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem, is that that's an easement, you can't build on that easement, it's a county easement. So you have to set your building back, so that's an incorrect view. I mean, we have, that's part of the questions that I've raised, is what are the easements on this property? And we need to address them.
Yeah, that
also a
hasn't
good
come up
question.
as unbuildable, but I'm not always in the room for that part of the conversation.
I mean, does that also mean the Linear Arts Plaza can't be built there?
Well, I think that's why, I mean, it looks to me like the Linear Arts Plaza is just basically the embankment, and that's what it is. I don't think you're changing it any, maybe within the plaza you're moving it, but as it abuts Grove Street, it doesn't strike me. I mean, this is one of my questions I've asked but haven't gotten an answer to. What's going on with that embankment? What's going on with that easement?
Easements are only as effective as their enforcement, and so it's a question of, it's not a question necessarily of, are you allowed to do it by virtue of the easement? It's a question of, is the holder of the easement willing to let you do it? And
Well,
those
it's
are
the
two
county.
different questions.
Well, it
Yeah.
needs to be addressed in the
And so,
redevelopment plan.
totally
I think.
agree,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the county may be okay with doing something. I don't know, right?
Right.
Presumably, we don't know here. If we do, we should talk about that. But it's all a question of what is the holder of the easement willing to let you do, not there's an easement, therefore nothing can be done. Those
Therefore,
are
it
different
needs to be
things.
addressed in the plan. That's my point. Yeah.
To what extent, this part of Grove Street is the part that has the hump on it? To what extent does that hump affect this perception?
Well, the hump helps hide massing to the left and the right, because you'd be covering, the ground is rising, so the building would appear to be comparatively shorter. But the rise from this intersection to the crown of Grove is, I'd be surprised if it's more than 5 or 6 feet. The 11 feet I described is measured from the crown of Grove down to the left and right on either side. That's where the grade at the current underpass is the deepest. So, yeah. So a 6-story comparison, and I think the next view is Clover Hill. So we can see on the left is the gable end of part of the Matthew Carter homes, and obviously Clover Hill's on the right, and the project is visible on the middle left. So I pointed out earlier, this is one of the deepest step backs in the entire project. So the massing for the upper stories starts, I don't remember the number offhand, it might have been 20 feet or more. Starts well back from the building face, which is why this overall mass, again, just for comparative purposes, it's similar to a 4-story mass that would be built in a typical Main Street condition.
See, okay. I grew up in South Orange, and when I was a little kid, somebody proposed to take an underdeveloped, important parcel that was behind our house and build a Greek Orthodox church on it with a gold dome on the top. I was 8. My mother, 2 years out of Seton Hall Law School, went to war. I mean, like the town got hit by a cyclone. My mother organized neighbors, and that didn't get built. And instead, they built something smaller. Didn't love it, didn't hate it either. So the model that's been going around, I mean, some of my colleagues care more than others about the look on Bloomfield Avenue and the Canyon experience and all of that. And, I speaking only for myself, I've got kind of I'm less inclined to engage in warfare over that. But when I look at the model that was going around, and I think about it from the perspective of somebody who bought a house or, owns property nearby and is looking at that, and all of a sudden it's, this is now my neighborhood. This is what my property values are going to do. And look, I don't live there, and so I don't put myself in the shoes, and I'm looking forward to hearing. There's going to be an opportunity for public comment, and we're all looking forward to hearing it, because we want to hear what you have to say and your neighbors have to say. I'm just saying that maybe some people are gonna think this is great, it's gonna add to my values. Other people are gonna say, yikes, it's not. But that, to me, is what this is about, is that this is going to be impactful in ways that nothing else that we've done on Bloomfield Avenue, I think, and my colleagues will know better than I do, but I think that this is going to have more of a direct impact on real neighborhoods in Montclair than other things that we've developed. And so I really appreciate what you've done here. And I mean, I'm glad that Mr. Ayanwali asked you to do it, and I'm glad that you've done it, and you've done it honestly, and I appreciate that. But, you know, imagine that's your house there, and this is what you're about to have happen.
Number 1 Clover Hill.
I got it. But I just want you to understand that when I'm asking questions about this, it's not because I don't want this site built beautifully and built in a way that's good for Montclair, but to the extent that we can do it without really changing the dynamic of the neighborhoods that are back there. And so, you know, again, if we can try to find a way to harmonize everybody's objectives, nobody's going to be completely happy. There's no way we're going to make everybody happy. But if we can make everybody a little less unhappy, I would consider that a good day's work. But that's why I wanted to skip ahead to this slide, is because when the model was coming around and I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, if I'm one of those little houses on Clover Hill, looking up at that building, I know it's not as big as it could look. I got it, but it's still big. End of sermon.
And the other part that goes along with that, Ira, is that we seem to have historically seen that developers will put on their best face on Bloomfield Avenue and put on the nice materials. And then when you get around to the side streets, you get crap. And then we have to spend a whole lot of time twisting arms and bending ears to get them to improve something that you can see. You know, you might even be able to see it from Bloomfield Avenue in one case that I can remember recently. But, you know, things that, you know, you don't normally think about, but the materials that they're using on the thing. And I don't know whether this plan really deals with that requirement. The way that the models, see, I think the models are quite helpful. I don't think that they're as helpful as an 8-foot model, but I think that they're very helpful in depicting the size in the scale of what you're proposing as opposed to what's there. And one of the things that the models do show is that your asymmetrical layer cakes
Thank you.
are really not the best for the people who have the backsides of the buildings, okay? And you know, the one thing that one of the things that I have a regret about this, you know, all the things that all the things that I've participated in being on the board is the back of the Sienna. Because every time I go down the street, I cringe when I look at the back of that building. Because I'm one of those people who don't think that the Sienna actually looks bad from the front, but the back of it that you can see from the street that runs behind and where it's just horrendous. It's ugly. And there's nothing that can be done about it. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to repeat that. The other thing I want to say is that when you're depicting this worst-case scenario of the 6-story building right on the property line, you cannot cover that whole property with a 6-story building and park it, too, at the density that you're proposing, okay? So that's really not the worst-case scenario, and it really wouldn't be, somebody might build a block 6-story building there, but it's not going to take up the whole property, and so they're not going to put it on the sidewalk and then have the rest of the property in back of it blank. Okay, they're going to balance it because they want people to live there. So I'm just saying that I get what you're saying in terms of the perspective. I mean, I think a while ago I may have been part of the group that's first talked about setbacks and how they can reduce things. And if we were in a situation like New York City where we were built out and you could only see stuff from the sidewalk and you couldn't see things from a distance, that has a lot more impact than this project, which is not in a typical downtown area. It can be seen. It's on the widest street in town. Actually, and Grove Street isn't doing too bad either with the numbers on the width. And you can see on the model, wherever it is, you can see the sight lines that, that are vast sweeping sight lines, and you're not on the sidewalk. I'm not impressed with being on the sidewalk and only seeing 4 stories up. I'm impressed being down the street and not seeing a giant mass of building, and so there, again, a few years ago, when this thing was being considered, and we had talked, there was talk about building a tower in it, I was willing to kind of see how you could do something in the center of the property that would be taller if it was something that was narrower and you could get your number of units in, but it had to be surrounded by something that was lower so that you got something, that wasn't a blocky mass, But this is very spread out. It looks like it reminds me of a Washington, D.C. kind of complex build, and it's incongruent with this area. It doesn't fit that aesthetic. You're changing the aesthetic of the area. So if you're okay with changing the aesthetic of Lackawanna Plaza, but I'm having real difficulty with how different this will make the area look, and I'm not necessarily seeing it yet making it look better in a good way, making it look different in a good way. I'm not opposed to different. But I want different to be better, and, I'm having problems reaching that. With what I'm saying.
Understood. You've covered a lot of ground and covered it really well. I think we've all, myself included, learned from a few decades of experience. For the record, I'm very sympathetic to that tower vision you outlined. I think you'll be happy to know, though, that the redevelopment plan has in the design standards a section devoted to building in the round. It's actually what it's called, which talks about the importance of designing and applying quality detailing materials on all visible facades. It doesn't talk about it talks against the idea of the back of a building. The building needs to be well detailed and well considered equally on all sides, so that is covered. But you raised a lot of good points about the massing, standing zoning. I think I didn't want to give the impression that the intent was to say, imagine if this were all 6 stories tall. Rather, it was just to show, because the project is large, from these vantage points, how it relates to a project of a different breed that is, built more to the property line and so on. Yeah. Shall I continue?
Please.
Okay. I think we only have a few more slides. So we're not going to do that. Don't worry about that. I think this is actually the last slide. So again, we're on Bloomfield looking west with the Montclair Mews on the right. And this lines up very well with 4 stories because the 4-story element is what's featured on this building. Because beyond it, we have building C pulled back. There's a void here, so that's more see-through because the 4-story wall doesn't continue, and the pushing back of building C relates to opening up lines of sight to the waiting room. And then just the example of 6 stories.
What's the height on that, Mr. Smith?
Of 6 stories?
No, of that rendering of that building.
So I think that, well, I need to double check.
Thank you.
Building E.
70.
Page 27 says it's 70 feet.
And then, Mr. Neiman, what is it on the 4th floor? Do you know how far?
It's got a 10-foot step back, floors 1 through 4, another 10 feet on 5, and then 30 feet on 6.
But what's the height on the first floor? The first 4 stories.
That I'm going to have
We're
to
not
defer to
sure?
Mr. Smith.
Okay.
You must be wrong there, Jacob. There's no building that's 70 feet. It must be 75 feet.
If you look at the frontage on Bloomfield
Oh,
Avenue.
the frontage, okay.
The height,
The height is
the height
70,
on
right,
Bloomfield
all right.
Avenue is 70,
Yeah.
but it's different on different
Okay.
sides.
It's okay, Mr. Smith, I don't need to hold up the whole group. We can
The
get that
answer
answer.
may be,
Page 27, yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I can't give the exact number. So I believe, let's see. Yeah, that is our last slide. So we could go back to any particular image, or I am happy to put the mic down, and if the board has additional questions, comments, conversation with public, what have you, turn it back to the chair.
Are there further questions from the board?
On
this?
because we've got this little piece of paper that I was hoping to talk about too, and I don't know whether
Well,
that's with.
we're further questions of Ira. I mean, Ira, I don't think can
No,
talk to the.
I think Ira actually is the person who's going to talk. I don't think anybody else is, but if you tell me, is there anybody other than you who's able to answer questions about this little supermarket thing?
I'm sure Director Talley would have something to add to that, I think.
But
I
no,
don't-
no witness for.
There are no additional presenters this evening.
I take it we'll be left with a copy of the presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do have a question. I think I listened to the HBC meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think at the last planning board meeting, I had given the heights of the heights of the area buildings. And I think at the HBC meeting, you said I was incorrect in what I had given, either you or Janice. And if I am incorrect, I'd like to be corrected. And the correct heights of the Matthew Carter, Grove and Ridge Building, Union Gardens, Willow Glen Ridge Avenue, the Bankers Building, Verizon Building, Greek Taverna, and Pig and Prince, and 1 Greenwood. I think someone had said my statement was incorrect. So I'd like to
I
know
don't,
what the heights of those buildings are. As far as I can tell, most of them are half the size of your largest building. Not your, but the development. building.
I'm
If-
sorry, I don't
Okay.
recall the subject
All right, that's okay.
coming up. I know we were referring to other more recent projects that are comparable in height.
Yeah, that's
Um,
this exhibit. And you
Yeah.
had, Janice, I guess, had typewritten this up, but I had gone to the trouble of
Yeah, I
looking at
don't-
Google Earth and
I don't
doing the heights of
question
the other building. Okay,
that.
I thought someone did at the HBC. Okay.
I don't think it was me. Happy to be corrected,
Might
but,
have been Janice.
yeah.
I don't think it was me, Carmel.
It was somebody.
So,
That must have been Keenan.
Yeah, it was Keenan.
He's not here.
So when we arrived for the meeting, we received a certification from Ann Babineau, who is a very good lawyer, who's an attorney for BDP Holdings. And what the certification says, among other things, is that there is a lease that has been executed between BDP Holdings and an unnamed supermarket operator, and that the lease, I'm not going to quote because I don't want to paraphrase it, includes provisions and exhibits that evidence that the BDP and the supermarket have agreed upon features of the store, including fundamental lease provisions such as size of the store, layout, parking, ingress and egress, loading, drop-off area, signage, and a site plan for the store that includes retention of the stanchions that are to remain along the Bloomfield Avenue side of the building. So, look, again, I think everybody here supports the supermarket, which was a condition of it was a starting point here, and we all want the supermarket to succeed over the long term. And in order for it to do that, it has to compete for the business of people with cars. It's not going to survive just on the basis of people who can walk there. And so, last week, a number of colleagues here asked some very good questions about exactly these issues. And we had hoped that we would be able to inquire of somebody who could speak for, even if they wanted to remain unnamed, the supermarket operator about those things. So, look, seeing that there is a lease and that some people out there are talking about these features is great, but our inability to ask questions does not help us in the slightest. And again, I'm not trying to put you in a bad position. I know you can't answer these questions because you're not a supermarket guy. I'm not a supermarket guy. But it's, I appreciate that somebody made an attempt to do something with this declaration, but this declaration doesn't help us at all. It doesn't give us anything we can ask, it doesn't give us anything we can inquire about. It doesn't give us a whole lot of confidence that the supermarket is going to do the things it needs to do to survive 10 years after it opens. So I don't, again, this is not an attack on you. I'm not trying to put you in a bad position, and I appreciate that an attempt was made. But not having somebody here to address those concerns, I think, was a mistake.
Ms. Talley, somebody, one of the board members had suggested potentially receiving some kind of redacted document that could give us more information about the grocery store. Is that something that could be a possibility that we could?
I requested
Request.
the additional information from the developer, from BDP Holdings. And so they were aware of what you requested, and that's why they submitted the certification. That's all I can say.
We still have time.
Do you have a redacted lease in your bag of tricks that you would pull out if we asked you for it? I'm asking.
I do not have a redacted
I'm not asking
lease.
you. I'm asking Ira.
No.
If you don't ask, you never know.
So Ira,
I have a bag of tricks, but that's not it.
were any of the things that are in the lease, that are being promised to the supermarket, the eventual lessee of the property, were any of those details, incorporated into the plan that you have been a part of putting together?
Well, yes. I mean, I asked the same kinds of questions Mr. Jacobson's asking, and I was told, hearsay, that everything I was seeing had been reviewed and was done with the approval of the supermarket, including recommendations where they would like to see their signage on the site as well as on the building.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I hope that a lot of people understand, we've been down this road before, where we sat for a year and a half, looking at plans, and then the evening of the final vote, it was revealed of who the supermarket was going to be. This is in the previous, not that we should compare to two different entities, but, for me, I'm not speaking for the rest of the board here, it was a bad feeling. I felt duped at the end of the day when it was all said and done, that at the very last moment at that meeting, all of a sudden it could be revealed of what the grocery store was that night. And it left a really bad taste and feeling for me. And I feel like this is deja vu all over again with this. And I understand there's I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what this all means, but this is our town, and everybody wants a supermarket. It's been 7 years without a grocery store, and it's just sad that we can't be excited about something, that we're going to get this fabulous grocery store, and I think it would make it's like a prize.
Well, Counselor,
and we have nothing. We've done this before.
Counselor, it's a very good point, and while we cannot dictate the exact grocery store, we can address some of your concerns through language in the redevelopment plan, a definition of what you want to see.
But Janice, you can't
Ms.
suspend the
Talley,
laws.
Ms. Talley, though, we need information in order to explain to them what we want to see in the plan. Like, for example, it was mentioned at the last planning board meeting that there will be deliveries, and I don't know how that works. I don't know the extent of deliveries. I don't know the number of trucks. I don't know the number of times that they come in and out of circulation. But that is going to impact traffic. It's going to impact a lot of issues.
I think.
But that's one example. So I think if the more information that we can get redacted to understand what's going to be there, it would be exceedingly helpful in order for us to lay out what our concerns are.
So I hear, and BDP Holdings, here's what you're saying. I can't guarantee that we're going to get that. We may or we may not. Moving ahead, you're concerned about loading. Okay, so then let's put language in the redevelopment plan that addresses that concern. There will be loading, there will be deliveries. You go to any new grocery store, that's what they have. So it's going to have loading, it's going to have deliveries. What you need to do is write into the redevelopment plan how you want that addressed.
Janice, we don't even know what size of it is. That's not in the redevelopment
No,
plan.
you don't.
What the minimum and maximum size
Well,
of a
again,
grocery
if you
store
read
should
my
be.
memo-
Yet, you have been talking at every public meeting that it's a 40,000 square foot grocery store. How can you say that when it's not even in the redevelopment plan?
Well, I can say that because that was what was the concept,
Well, that's
okay?
very deceptive, to come
Well-
to the public and say that it's going to be a 40,000 square foot supermarket when it's not even in the plan. It could be 20,000,
Well,
it could be 18,000.
Okay, so.
It could be
so-
65, so it's a big range, yet
Can-
the public thinks they're getting a
can-
40,000 square foot grocery store. The other thing is, just
Can
if I may.
wait a minute.
Yep.
Wait a minute. Let me answer. You're not even giving me a chance to answer. If you look in the memo that I distributed, you raised a very good point. The concept plan that was presented to us was 40,000 square feet. But that was the plan that we used to build the redevelopment plan. And my comment in the memo that I distributed to all the board members is, good point. Why don't we put a minimum and maximum in there?
That was my point, put a minimum and maximum in there. But how can you have 4 meetings and talk about it?
Carmel, okay,
All right.
can I finish? It's a draft plan. I agree with you. It's a very good point. Let's put it in there. So what else? I'm saying I agree with you and we should put it in there. But what I'm asking you as a board, okay, and we've had this discussion. We've had certain board members say 20,000 square feet is too big, 40,000 square feet is too small. So if you want, again, that's what I'm trying to say. What do you want to see? And we can put that in in the redevelopment plan. If you want a range, give me a range that you feel comfortable with. You're concerned about parking. You're concerned, and you know that they're going to have structured parking. Whatever concerns you have about that, we can add it or make a recommendation to address it in the redevelopment plan. Deliveries. You know,
Yes.
you have, where should they store their delivery vehicles?
Great question.
And if they're, so
I
if
didn't
you
even
don't,
think
if
of
you
that.
want them,
That's a wonderful
maybe you
question,
should say
yeah.
the delivery vehicles should be stored in a manner so that they're not visible from the street.
No, Jen, and
don't know.
look, I respect that you've been trying to get the information out to the public. I don't think there's an intent to mislead anybody. What I think the concern I think that we all have, though, is that we're limited in the information, and we need to push back to get as much as we can.
Oh, 'cause
And I respect where you're coming from. It is very helpful to have you mention things like, let's talk about where to store the delivery trucks, and those are some items that, you know, I would not think of as a year and a half on the board. So I'd like to work, if there's a way that we can put a committee together, work outside of this also, specifically on the grocery questions. I think that would be something helpful.
That's why
So-
I tried to get the conversation going. The memo I distributed to you took all the questions
Terrific.
and comments, and I tried to answer them where I could.
Yep.
And there were some very good points, and this is your opportunity. It's obviously the plan's adopted by the council. It's your opportunity to say, we recommend this change or this addition. Okay, the other thing, yes, we had a concept plan, and we worked around that concept plan to build this redevelopment plan. But bear in mind, that concept plan's it's not set in stone. It could change. There's nothing to say that they have to build that concept plan that was presented to us. What does remain in effect is the language in our redevelopment plan. And that's why I keep going back to, let's go through the language in the redevelopment plan. You want a definition of a grocery store. If there's a certain kind of grocery store or supermarket you want to see, one that has a wide variety of products, let's define that in there.
I think if we could see some parameters, some guidelines that you know would help guide us, I think that would be helpful. And then I think we should probably put together a committee specifically on this to address what we would like to see in the grocery from the grocery store.
I'm very uncomfortable because more and more I'm hearing the term grocery store. And I don't think we're looking for a grocery store. Because a
Okay.
grocery store will not survive. We're looking for a supermarket.
Then we
And
will
I think
change
that
all
I'm hearing
references.
more and more of a dilution of language that I'm uncomfortable with.
That was not intentional on my part, Ms.
I know
Willis,
it wasn't, but
because
I
it was
just hear it.
purely
And I think really basically is that
Rhetorical.
we're asking for some details so that we can feel comfortable with the actual factual description of what is being given. And even though it's very kind and to have a memo from someone who says, gee, we got this, don't worry about it, we've got this covered, don't worry, we've got this covered. I don't know that that really gives us the comfort to vote with it and feel that we are getting what we want.
I think it's a starting
And-
point.
And somehow, you had a term that I kind of remember, the
Unsworn double hearsay.
unsworn double
This is
hearsay.
sworn
And
single
now
hearsay.
we've got triple hearsay, so I don't really know that I'm comfortable with where we're going with it, so.
Can I add something else into this mix also? Having worked for a supermarket for 20 years, I can tell you that there's certain aspects where at least, my knowledge is a little bit older now. It's about 10 years out of date, but I think things haven't changed that much in 10 years. But supermarket is not going to change its operation for one store, okay? And supermarkets, there's certain things that are general, they do, but there's other things that are very specific to their logistics operations and how their distribution works and where they get their product from and how it gets delivered. And we're not going to be able to dictate that. And we're not going to be able to prescribe a plan that's going to say, we want X, Y, and Z if the supermarket that we want doesn't do business that way. That's just going to drive them away. So, I think that we can I understand what Janice is saying, and I think there's some validity to it that, if there's certain things that we want, we can describe that this is what we want to have that into the plan, but we have to be prepared at the end of the day to be somewhat flexible with those things, and we're not going to be able to dictate it chapter and verse that we want them to only have one deliveries or deliveries between this hour and that hour, because they're going to say, forget it, it's too much trouble. We don't operate that way. We've got all these other, stores to supply, and we're not going to, throw ourselves out of joint for one store.
Well, I would agree with you on that, but what I'm not really getting what I need is that the plan that they tell us is one that I can feel comfortable about. And I'm not hearing anything. I'm just hearing we got that covered. And I want to be able to know that what I hear makes sense. For example, the visibility of it, as we talked about, the fact that if you're coming south if you're coming east down Bloomfield Avenue, that you would actually pass the intersection you have to turn at before you even knew that you had to turn. I'm just concerned that the logistics of what we're hearing have not been well defined enough for me to feel comfortable that it makes sense. And I feel that basically I'm pretty wide open to a lot of different ways to run a business. I'm not a business person, but I am a customer and I know what you want. You want something that people can arrive at comfortably, park, and go inside and shop. Right. These are the issues that we raised. Not so much trying to run the business.
Right.
But just to know that it's a business that can thrive. And I don't know that I've heard enough detail to me to just relax and feel that we can solve something.
So that's
that
one
this
thing, we've
board
got
can pass.
the plan has to be fleshed out more in terms of some of those details. Tony?
I have a suggestion on the supermarket. On page 24 of the redevelopment plan, there's a sentence which says, each building shall contain a minimum gross floor area dedicated to permitted non-residential principal uses. So my assumption is that the supermarket is in Building A, and that space is 90,000 feet. So a simple add might be to determine how much of that 90,000 square feet should be a supermarket. It's a very easy change to mandate, and that could be straightforward. Now, I'm making the assumption that the supermarket is in Building A, which is supposed to have 90,000 square feet of, I presume, retail, although I'm not sure, but you could state what minimum
office too.
requirement. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's got to be an A or B, because
here's-
that's where the
Jacob,
deliveries.
Go ahead, I'll go next.
I just want to put a quick Post-it note on something so we don't forget it. I think it'd be a great idea to put in the plan that no overnight vehicle storage is allowed on that driveway loop, to make sure all the vehicle storage happens in the structured parking.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so just a pin there. And then just a quick question, and I think it may have come up in one of the meetings prior, but I'm not certain. Do we know of any other municipalities in the state that have essentially mandated a grocery store via a redevelopment plan. If we don't know if that's happened, it'd be great if we could find out. If we do know that it's happened, I think it'd be great to try to get some lessons learned, whether positive or negative, from that experience.
But, okay, so, thank you. Janice, neither a redevelopment plan nor a site plan can suspend the laws of economics. And so, before I joined this board, you all dealt with the hotel issue, and so the town kind of extended itself because we wanted a hotel, and so we built a big building that's now a hotel. Maybe the hotel is going to survive for the long term, maybe it's not, and if it doesn't, then we're going to have a big building that's going to be not a hotel. So the supermarket, I mean, unless I'm wrong, and I don't think I am, this will be built, supermarket will come into it. If after a few years the supermarket doesn't survive, BDP is going to be just fine. The supermarket operator is going to be just fine because they got plenty of other supermarkets. They close this market and they're going to, be just fine, and we're going to be left with a hole that's not going to be supermarket. And so the problem that we're trying to solve for is how can we help the supermarket to survive over a long term, and there's really nobody looking out for the long-term interest of that thing being a supermarket except the township. The township is the only entity that's trying to do this, and so we can't just say, okay, leave it to them and let them do their thing, because the supermarket operator is going to give it a try, and if it doesn't work, they're going to leave, and we're going to be right back where we started from. So that it's just, that's why I was hoping that we could come in and we could try to be helpful, because Chair is exactly right. They're not going to step and fetch it to what we want, but we can make some suggestions that would be consistent with what they want. And I don't think we can just build it. We can just say, okay, we'll build it, our preferences in, and it'll be what it'll be. Because again, without a dialogue, we can't have a dialogue, for lack of a better. But Carol's, I mean, what you said was wisdom. I mean, that was exactly right. It's not a grocery store, it's a supermarket, and it's got to work.
And I'm sure they want it to work. I mean, I can't believe that anyone, wants to come in and fail. I don't think that, and I'm not even expecting that. It's just that when we hear it described, it should be something that we can sort of feel comfortable with. And that's my point. And I don't want to be disrespectful, because I know that they want to succeed as much as anyone would. But I really would just like to hear a plan that we can feel comfortable with and feel that it's going to work.
So we've got to put something together for the council to advise them of our opinion with respect to the, how this stacks up vis-a-vis the master plan. And then on top of that, there's the other things that are tangential, like what we've just been talking about, that, need to be, I think, voiced and raised during the same opportunity. So that's what we've got to put together and get it out to the council in the remaining 40-some-odd days that are left. I know you all have provided Janice with certain feedback. Some of you, and I know Janice has been taking notes during the proceedings on various things that we've raised, but I think what we have to do now is kind of do some drafting to make sure that we get all of these things that we've been saying over these past two evenings into some cohesive form, so that the council will understand, what our position is with respect to this. Because I think we've heard basically from everybody, from all the experts, who are going to testify to explain what the plan is to us. It sounds like, we're having problems seeing that the plan as it's offered now necessarily meets all of the requirements of the master plan, or is consistent, with everything in the master plan. And I think we have some suggestions as to how it could be modified to improve it so that it would come more in line with the master plan, and also provide something that will last in the town, looking at the long game as opposed to, just the short game. So that's what we've got to do. We can't do that from this dais this evening, and we can't have, I don't think between now and the time that this is due to the council, we could have another meeting where we could just work on this. So it's something that we've got to basically, and we can't have another meeting, without proper notice and all. So I think what we have to do now is communicate our final comments to Janice, have Janice put that together, and then that can be something that can be sent out to the individual boards to edit, like we do our resolutions, and such.
How many meetings do we have before this is due?
We have 2 meetings, January 9th and January 23rd. We do have applications, so we don't have a lot of time at those meetings to dedicate just to this, but.
So if we could get a head start by getting these drafts together, then we can have, if we need to have further discussions at those meetings, then we can. But, we can't, I don't think we can afford to really devote another whole meeting to just trying to wordsmith the document. And then plus based on how we wordsmith our minutes sometimes. I don't know if we would even accomplish that, if a meeting would be enough. We might need more than a meeting. So if we kind of do this in combination with in our off time, individually, so that we're not violating any laws, about us having prohibited meetings, and then when we come together at the meetings, in addition to taking care of our other business, we can refine what we're saying about this. Because I think we've kind of said it all over the course of these couple of nights. Carmel, you're like
Not really, no, I have a bunch of questions that weren't answered.
Well,
so-
but I think that in itself
Yeah.
is the issue. Then
Right.
that's what,
Right.
those questions are, because we
I know, I understand.
may
It's
not
time,
get
yeah.
answers
Yes,
to
yeah,
those
yeah,
questions.
yeah.
And again, our role is to say whether it's consistent or inconsistent.
Yes.
And if you have something that you don't have an answer to, then you can't make that determination. So that in and of itself is your answer. You don't have enough information
Okay.
to give an answer. And so in order for you to do that, you would need X, Y, and Z
Right.
to further,
So are you suggesting that we should all make comments on the draft redevelopment plan?
Not on the plan, because we're not rewriting the
Well,
plan per se.
that's what we do with minutes.
We are telling the council, here's where this
Okay, I get
fails.
it. Yeah, yeah,
Okay?
yeah, like we did
And here's
last
how it could be changed in broad strokes, not
Page by
giving,
page?
not giving them a page by page, chapter by chapter, but you need to have better language for this, you need to have better language for that. When they redraft it, if they redraft it, then what happens with it?
Then it would be reintroduced.
And then it would come back to us, right?
That, I don't know how that would work. If it's your changes that are being into it.
Well,
maybe-
let's find out
Yeah, I'm
between
not
now and
sure
the
about
next
that.
meeting, because if it doesn't come back to,
Yeah, I mean,
so if it doesn't come back to us, then we have to be, and once we know that, that will determine the level of specificity that we will
Yeah,
need
I mean,
in our communication
I
to
mean,
the
I think it
council.
would be helpful to the council if we went through the plan and gave them suggestions, so they don't have to do it, at least, but.
Well, it's,
Is the redevelopment subcommittee going to give
I
us
don't
a
know,
report?
that's a question. Are we going to, the redevelopment subcommittee going to work on this? I mean, I think you've basically said
do
everything
you
we could
have,
possibly say.
do the committee members have time to get together and give a markup of the plan?
And does that look like us as a board voting on each individual mark? I think it can very
The
quickly.
subcommittee is 3 members.
No, I know, but if the
We would
the
have to look at
redevelopment
it. We
subcommittee
would
is
have
making
to-
comments, we then need to give,
We
or
would-
presumably would want to give our own comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so does that look like us going through the document line by line, making decisions on
Right.
those comments? And so I think there's a lot that needs to be addressed, but striking that balance of
Right.
going through line by line, 100 some odd page master plan, or redevelopment plan is an arduous task.
But
What
some of
what
us
he
have
says
done
is
it
exactly
already.
right. We need
Yeah.
we need a balance
Yeah.
here, because it's not, even if we redraft it, we gave them our opinion to redraft it, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they would accept, and then they would rewrite things, and then, so I think we need to be very clear in the parameters that we want them to operate
Right.
in, if we were the body that was drafting, and here's how we think that it should lay as your planning experts. This is what we think it should contain. And leave it up to the drafters to put down the specific words if we give them precise enough parameters. Because that's what this document, the redevelopment plan really is. It's parameters for what goes on the site.
Right.
So,
Are we, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but the buildings, as presented, was very helpful today, seeing the buildings more clearly. What else are we going to get on traffic? I know that, because I find it, unless I missed it, we didn't have much in the way. It seems like the buildings are rather well defined enough, and uses are defined such that the number of trips and cars and parking, it doesn't seem like it's that much of a stretch to do a traffic and parking plan based on these uses, which are pretty clear.
well, do we,
And I
do
don't
we
know
do,
when that comes in the process.
well, that's a site plan.
Or is it even our?
That's a site plan issue, right? The traffic circulation?
It is, but I do think the council's going to do their own independent traffic study.
Right, but I think we can suggest that, we don't want the level of service for the intersections
Right.
to drop below a certain
Absolutely.
point. We don't want there to be safety concerns with left turns into parking lots. We want there to be very adequate wayfaring so that people know where they're going, so they're not circling the blocks. We can set parameters like
Right.
that.
Very good.
So you're saying that individually, we should all do something like that, and then collectively, we'll look at what the group put together, and then.
Well, Janice will put it
Oh,
together,
yes.
and then we will review it.
Okay.
And then if, and that next meeting is going to be, our next meeting is in January.
January 9th.
So between now and January 9th, if we can get stuff to Janice, within the next week or so, then she has time to put something together for us to discuss, at least discuss at the next meeting.
Right.
If we can't get it gelled at that meeting, then we still have another meeting to work on it.
Right.
And one other layer to this also, the Historic Preservation Commission, we had our meeting last Thursday, and we felt it would be beneficial to provide our report to the planning board, who could then submit directly to the council, both reports together. And our goal is to make sure that we have that to the board with sufficient time to review and hopefully make the planning board report as robust as possible. I don't anticipate being able to get it by the January 9th meeting, but we have committed to getting it with sufficient time to review and to have it noticed for that second meeting in January.
John, it's probably worth you putting on the record when we're going to hear public comment.
We don't take public comment at this, because we have a very limited role. We determine whether or not this is in line with the master plan. The council has the hearing on the plan, and they're the ones who take the public comment on it.
So just to be sure, there's no redevelopment subcommittee that's doing anything. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
So I've been trying to decide when to introduce this topic. I've been needling with it over the weekend, and I don't know how popular it'll be. We talk a lot.
Don't let that stop you.
I won't. We talk about consistency with the master plan. I went back, I read over master plan, particularly in the areas of circulation. I gathered some data from the bid, from Janice, to try to work through this. Montclair Center, not including Lackawanna Plaza, has about 2,700 parking spaces throughout the whole community, throughout the bid. And that's for about 3.3 million square feet of leasable space, 3.3 million square feet of commercial space. That leads to essentially a rough calculation, and these are all pretty good numbers, but approximate, about 1,200 square feet per parking space of gross leasable space. The low estimate for Lackawanna Plaza is 925 parking spaces for roughly 476,000 square feet of leasable space. That's a 14% increase in leasable space for Montclair Center and a 33.5% increase in parking spaces. That's 514 square feet per parking space. Our master plan repeatedly talks about our parking minimums being those of a car-centric, sprawl-dependent suburb. And while Montclair is not like anywhere else, it's certainly not a car-centric, suburban, sprawled suburb. We have a robust, dense street grid. We have a large capacity for mass transit, whether that be in the form of buses, trains. We've got 6,000 people per square mile. That's larger than some major cities. We have an incredible opportunity to shift our focus towards building a Montclair that's going to be sustainable, one that's not clogged with personal cars, and by increasing, on the low end, right, with shared parking, the amount of parking spaces in Montclair Center by 31%, that's a huge number. That's a full third more parking spaces for less than a fifth more real estate. If we want to go to the high number, because shared parking is not necessarily what this board wants, there's going to be 39% more parking spaces, almost 40% more parking spaces in Montclair Center. The square footage of either of those numbers, if you have the low number, that's 31% of the gross leasable area, like the equivalent to 31% of the gross leasable area is going to be parking. We're going to have 150,000 square feet of parking. That's on the low end. On the high end, it's 178,000 square feet of parking. It's a ton of land. So many of these numbers around parking and around traffic were given without context, right? We learned that there would be an estimated from the traffic study, which we may or may not consider useful in this circumstance, about 280 some odd new traffic trips from this. That was not given with context. We learned that there's going to be 1,100 parking spaces or 925 parking spaces given without the context of how many are already in the community. I think it's really important to have that context. We have a bus stop at Lackawanna Plaza and the paired one across the street on Bloomfield Avenue that gets hundreds of people using it a day, and it gets a throwaway line in the plan. Our master plan consistently talks about how we need to increase the ability to access our transit terminals without cars, but we don't talk about where people can store their bikes. We don't talk about how people can walk safely to those places. We don't talk about, other than a small strip on Glenridge Avenue, of a bike lane so people can ride their bike in confidence that they're not going to get hit by a car. I leave this meeting wearing a light-up vest because I want to be visible to everyone, because I'm riding down a street that does not think about me as a cyclist. And I would like this plan to think about me as a cyclist. We're very concerned about the scale and the character. Montclair Center's character is not 433 square feet per parking space. It's 1,200 square feet per parking space. The character of the community is broader than the heights and the types of uses, and I think it's really important that we consider that parking is out of character. Montclair developed as a railroad suburb The train, we have 6 train stations because that was the only way to get around. And so every new parking lot is out of character if we're going to continue that line of thought, right? And so I understand it is a different time and cars are popular and necessary. And the developer, whoever that may be, is going to want to ensure that their business is successful. And so they will build parking, and they will build plenty of parking. I want to make sure we don't build more parking than we need, because our decks are not full. Our street spots are full. And that's a policy choice, because parking on the street is underpriced. We don't charge enough for it, because decks are inconvenient. And so people are not going to spend more to go to a deck. They're going to wait for that spot on the street. And so I think we should address that. We should address the fact that we undercharge for parking and probably overcharge for the decks so that we get more people in those decks, so our downtown has fewer cars and is better for people. I would just like this plan to focus on the people who are going to be using it and maybe decide to spend a little less than 37% of the, an equivalent to 7% of the building area on cars. Focus more on the people, not on the cars. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to, I would like to respond to that, Chair, if that's okay.
Please.
I respect what you're saying, Mr. Neiman, and I think that we should have a more robust and fulsome discussion about ways to mitigate traffic. But I think, to Ms. Laughlin's point last week, if we don't park this correctly, the people who are going to get the spillover are the surrounding neighborhoods. These standards are in place for a reason. Experts have studied why we need certain numbers for certain uses. We're talking about adding 375 residential units, a supermarket, commercial office space, restaurants. We're already putting in large, substantial buildings here. Something's going to get built here, and it's probably going to be large. The concern is that the residents are going to be dealing with that. I don't want them also to have to deal with cars flooding their streets as well. I think there is a longer, more in-depth conversation to have about this and how we encourage. I think you made some great suggestions about pricing alone is one way to encourage more off-street parking. But ultimately, I think the point that the residents will have to deal with the spillover, we better get this parking right, and we better not underpark it, because this neighborhood is going to have to deal with it.
I understand and appreciate your point, and I'm just as concerned about the possibility of overparking, right? Our decks are not full. They are simply not. And we just opened a 300-spot deck, which from what I've been hearing is maybe 20% full, and it's not far from this location. There are going to be times in the year when Pride and the Jazz Festival happen that this town will be filled with cars, right? And that is inevitable. And we can prepare for that, but we can't build for that, because then we're spending millions of dollars on parking that's going to be used once, twice a year. Some numbers I got from Janice were that a structure spot costs about $25,000 per spot on the low end, $30,000 on the high end. For the low amount of parking at $25,000 a spot, we're looking at $23 million just to build the parking for this project. We want this project to be accessible and affordable and economical, right? Throwing $23 million on top of this project does not do that.
We're
If
not
we wanna
paying
go
for
to
we're not paying for the parking.
No, but
in
the
this project.
375 families that are going to be renting these apartments are. And the grocery store is going to be.
I hear you.
It all goes to that. And
I hear you, but it's a very complicated. It's not black and white.
Of course.
It's a very complicated mix, because I have a different opinion. While I don't necessarily disagree with you, I think that people park where it's most convenient, and that they will park on the street regardless of how much you charge for it, because if I can park in front of that door and I don't have to walk down the street, I'm not going to do that. The other thing about it is that we want and have been promoting and developing, and when I say we, I mean the town, as a whole, as Montclair as a destination.
Yeah.
So we're just not talking about parking Montclairians. We are talking about parking people who come to visit, who come to the town to use the goods, to enjoy the entertainment, everything that other things that we've been trying to develop that also contribute to the flavor of the town. These are the types of things and we have to be able to park those people, because we're not going to be able to attract more businesses and more customers for those businesses unless we have adequate parking. And parking has been a problem for a long time. And whether that is changing now because we have built so much parking, we have a lot of addition to the parking now recently, and whether or not that has changed, well, we're going to have to see when all of this stuff, all of these projects get built out, because the deck that you're talking about has been up for a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't know whether or not it's going to remain at 20%. But, well, yes. But, we have to really see once everything gets built in that area and fully developed and up, see how it's going to be used. And, this is something that we've wanted and we've talked about repeatedly, about trying to get accurate figures and up-to-date figures. And it's something that we're continuing to look at. But there are, I tend to think, that, the town grew because it had all these train stations, but every new house that gets sold, at least in my neighborhood, comes with 2 cars with New York license plates, okay? So these people are coming here, because they want to walk down to that train station and go to their job in the city. But on the weekends...
3 days a week.
Well, we'll see about that. But, on the weekends, they're doing stuff. They're going to Pennsylvania, they're going here, they're going there, let's face it, the prices of housing in this town, we've got a kind of an affluent community. We've got a lot of affluent people here. They're not thinking about taking the bus, okay? They're not thinking about riding their bicycles unless they're into that kind of thing. They're thinking about, hey, I want to run to the store. I want to do it as quickly as I can because I want to get back because I got something else that I want to do. Or I want to take that next step. I'm going to go to the store and then I'm going to go over here. So, and I'm not saying that that type of person is the majority. I'm saying that type of person is in this mix.
Yeah.
So we have to really get some good figures, some good usage figures on how those things are. And until we get those things, it's very hard for us to guesstimate how much is going to be this and how much is going to be that. And that's kind of why we're using the standards now based on the old studies. And I'm not saying that those standards may not be in need of revision. But the one thing that we want to do, we want to be conservative to a point, and we want to make sure that we have enough. The worst is to not have enough because space is limited, okay? And once it's developed, it's very hard to change that development, into a place. You can make retail space out of parking, but you can't make parking out of retail space unless your businesses are going to hell, and we don't want that.
I was going to say, cars drive into buildings a lot. You can make parking out of retail space.
Yeah, but if you've got a really healthy economy, thriving economy, you're not going to be turning buildings into parking lots. And it's hard for us to do the underground parking because Tony Brooks is every place.
Yeah. And I don't know that underground parking is the answer. I guess I'm just kind of the slight mirror image, right? I lean more toward the concern that we're going to overpark and that we're going to have too many facilities dedicated to parking that are, as this plan lays out, right? We don't like them. They're icky. They're unattractive, and they deaden areas, right? People frequently talk about the north end of Bloomfield Avenue the west end of Bloomfield Avenue kind of petering out over by Valley and Bloom. And I think part of that certainly is that, you're going up a hill. But it's also that there's a parking lot there right at the end, and that there's just nothing to look at and nothing to do right there. You're sitting at the end, and it's boring. And we acknowledge that in the plan that this parking is not attractive and ideal. And so I simply say we lean towards a little less, and we may be better off. And I think we stay consistent with our master plan, which says our zoning standards, which this redevelopment plan takes for parking, are that of a suburban sprawled community rather than the dense, walkable community that we are. And so I think that's what I've got. And I appreciate everyone giving me the time. I really do.
All right, so I think we have a plan in place to try and get this document out to the board, to the council rather. And Ira, we thank you for your presentation and for answering all of our questions and maintaining your composure and humor while doing it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, so we have bills. That's the next thing on our agenda. I believe we don't have any
Unless we have committee
reports. I don't think we have any committee reports since last week.
I assume not, and I reviewed the bills and would move to approve them.
And I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay,
All right,
that's it.
thank you all
Have a
for being
wonderful
here.
holiday.
Have a great
Thanks, everyone.
holiday.
Have a
Thanks,
good
everyone.
holiday.